All right, welcome to Modern Josephus. I hope the audio is working good this time. We'll see. I had to do a little fix. I sounded like a robot, so hopefully the fixes that I made will make it a little bit better. If not, I'll have to keep fiddling around with it. Um, I know that, at least in my opinion, it sounded better than the, the last couple of videos that I did. So today we are going to do Crash Course History, where U.S. politics came from. All right. So I know his perspective and I know where he's coming from. You can tell which side of which view of history he sees, how he sees history. So if he's going to make any lines that are tracing from back here till today, I guess we are going to find out if he tries to make that connection between this time period's politics and this time period's politics. Right off the bat, I'm just going to say that I don't believe in this political line especially not at this period. I think at this period it was very different, very, very different than it is today. So we'll go ahead and get into it, and I'll give you my thoughts as we go along. Let's start.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and now that we have a Constitution, it's actually United States history. Today we're going to look at the birth of America's pastime. Nope, Stan, not baseball, not football, not eating. I mean politics, which in America has been adversarial since its very beginnings, despite what the founders wanted.
Yeah, definitely. If you look at the beginning of politics, it got really heated and sometimes got worse than our politics today.
We looked at the first big conflict in American politics last week, Constitution or Articles of Confederation. I hope that I convinced you that we made the correct choice, but regardless, we made it. The Constitution passed. But immediately following the passage...
Yes, and I don't remember if I made it very clear, but because the Constitution passed, secession was no longer an option unless the federal government started taking away your rights explicitly. So,
of the Constitution, a pretty fundamental conflict came up. What kind of country should we be? Mr. Green, the U.S. is supposed to be the policeman of the world and keep all the people in the green parts of not America from hurting themselves. Oh, me from the past. We don't get into that stuff until 1823.
I'm guessing he's talking about the Monroe Doctrine.
So one vision of America was put forward by Alexander Hamilton, who'd served in the war as Washington's top aide and would go on to be his first Secretary of the Treasury and probably would have been president himself had he not been born in the British West Indies. Hamilton...
I want to read a book, Hamilton by Ron Chernow. Ron Chernow is a very good historian. I've read 2 of his books, and so we'll get into that. Talking about books real quick, this is my commercial break at the beginning of the video. Talk about books, I want to start a channel about all the books I have read, like a book review channel. The video should be shorter there, so, but yeah, I want to do a book review channel. So, but anyway, let's go ahead and keep watching.
Had a strong personality, and as you can see, the beautiful wavy hair of a Caribbean god. And he had very definite ideas about what he wanted the future of America to look like. First, Hamilton wanted the country to be mercantile, which means that he believed that we should be deeply involved in world trade. Second, he wanted the U.S. to be a manufacturing...
If he's talking about mercantilism, free trade doesn't have to do with mercantilism. Actually, mercantilism prevented free trade. Because under mercantilism, the only place you could trade with was with England. You couldn't trade with France. You couldn't trade with Spain. That's why smugglers that's why the British government tried to shut down smugglers, because smugglers were bringing in wine from France and Spain, and they weren't allowed to do that. They could only trade with the mother country, with Great Britain. So I don't understand why he's saying that he was for mercantilism. That would mean that you can only trade with the United States within the United States.
Powerhouse. We wouldn't just buy and sell stuff, we would make it too. He even invested in a plan to make Paterson, New Jersey a manufacturing hub, which of course ultimately failed because New Jersey. But to make
So is he saying that Hamilton only wanted trade within the United States and didn't want trade outside the United States? Maybe that's what he
a
said.
manufacturing giant, he needed a strong government that could build infrastructure and protect patents, but you already knew that he was in favor of a strong government because, of course, he wrote so many of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton also envisioned an America that was governed primarily by the elite. His party, which came to be known as the Federalist Party, would be the one of the rich, the able, and the well-born. I mean,
Yeah, Donald Trump there. Yeah, so this is where I do, when you look at early political politics, me, even as a conservative, when I look at this time period, I see pros and cons from both sides. And yes, we needed a strong central government, but then Hamilton was for too strong of a central government. He wanted to go a little bit too much.
I mean, just think if the Federalist Party had survived, we might have had a bunch of like Bushes and Kennedys as presidents. Hamilton also wanted America to be firmly affiliated with Great Britain, which isn't surprising given his passion for elitism and trade. But there was
also Great Britain was the power at that time in manufacturing, and the power they ruled the sea. So you kind of want to appease the biggest guy out there on the field.
There's an opposing view of what America should look like, and it's most associated with Thomas Jefferson. Let's go to the thought bubble. Jefferson wanted an America that was predominantly agrarian, with most people being small-scale, subsistence-level farmers. Maybe
that's where I wouldn't agree with Jefferson. I think both are good. You gotta be agrarian and you gotta be industrial. You can do a balance of both.
They would produce a little surplus for local markets, but certainly not for international consumers. There would be no international trade. And he didn't want manufacturing either. This small-scale local economy could best be served by a small-scale local government. It's not a surprise to find that Jefferson's sympathies lay with the anti-federalists.
However, I mean, that's what we got. We got a balance between local and federal governments. We actually have three governments. We have federal, state, and local.
Even though he benefited from the new Constitution a little bit, since, you know, he eventually got to be president and everything. Unlike the elitist Hamilton, Jefferson was an avowed Democrat, which meant that he distrusted concentrated power and privilege and believed that the masses could basically govern themselves. To him, government and concentrated economic power were greater threats to liberty than a tyrannical majority. Jefferson was a big fan of the French, and not only because he spent a fair amount of time in Paris as our ambassador there, he also liked the French because they fought with us in the War of Independence against the British, and because after 1789, he liked the way the French treated their aristocrats, that is, brutally. In general,
actually, that is false. At first, yes, he was for the French Revolution, but once he found out about Robespierre and everything that was going on, he actually started to push away from supporting that during the maybe not at that time. I can't remember. I know eventually he did, but maybe I'm thinking that he ended up doing it later on. He ended up denouncing it. Maybe at the time he didn't. But I think at the time also he was living in the U.S. again when that French Revolution started to pop up, because yes, he was back in the U.S. because he served as George Washington's Secretary of State. Yeah, Secretary of State. So he didn't go back to France when Robespierre and everything else was going on. So he did defend it, but he did not believe the reports of the guillotines or things like that. He thought it was the Federalists just conjuring up stories to attack him. And then later on in his life, when he found out that all those stories of guillotines and things actually did happen, he rejected the French Revolution.
General Jefferson and his partisans, who called themselves Republicans, although some current textbooks call them Democratic Republicans just to make things incredibly confusing, preferred France just as the Hamiltonians preferred Britain. And this was a bit of a problem because France and England were...
He said that he was Democratic, and yet on the banner it says Republican. So yeah, he would not have been for democracy as Democrats are today. He did not like mob rule either.
Pretty much constantly at war between 1740 and 1815. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So linked to these imagined Americas were the questions of how...
And it's not that I want to attack Democrats, even though I will attack the Democrat Party probably throughout most of this video. or throughout this history, um, because they were always on the wrong side of history throughout. But our founding fathers, all of them, including Thomas Jefferson, were strongly against just democracies. All right, that's why I especially am wary of Democrats who are for abolishing the Electoral College. And I think that uh, making our making Congress more democratic by making the Senate be voted in through the people is more dangerous. I am for more. I like how our constitutional republic was set up. I like how it was set up. I do not like the slavery. I do not like, those things, but how it was set up, the rules, the processes that we have to go to change laws, to change the morals in our country, I like that process.
How democratic we should be and how much free speech we should have. Jefferson and the Republicans wanted more democracy and more free speech. Well, sort of. I mean, during Washington's presidency, Democratic-Republican societies sprang up, the first opposition political parties, and in 1794, the Democratic-Republican Society of Pennsylvania published an address which made the point that, quote, freedom of thought and a free communication of opinions by speech or through the medium of the press are the safeguards of our liberties. The Federalists, on the other hand, saw too much free speech and democracy as a threat. And from this, it sounds like the Republicans were better Democrats, but it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah.
I mean, for one,
I'm glad he said it's a lot more complicated than that, because it is. It's not just, oh, the Democrat Republicans are the forefathers of today's Democrat Party. No, there's a lot of nuance, especially at this time.
many Republicans, including Thomas Jefferson, were slaveholders, and slavery is kind of the opposite of democracy. And for another, many were supporters of the French Revolution, and supporting the French Revolution after 1793 is pretty problematic. Because as you'll remember from Crash Course World History, Robespierre was guillotining everyone up until the point where he himself was guillotined.
Yeah, it was basically a regime. It was a dictatorship.
Okay, so in the first real American presidential election, there weren't any political parties. There wasn't even a campaign. The election was uncontested, and George Washington won. He didn't even have to run for office. He stood for it. Washington's presidency is important for a number of precedents that he set, including the notion that a president should only serve 2 terms, and the idea that even if he was a general, the president should wear civilian clothing. But he wasn't the real policy brains. Hamilton was. Washington probably wouldn't have called himself a Federalist, but he backed Hamilton's plan.
Washington was needed for his leadership. He was a leader, and people saw him as a leader. And yes, he was influenced by Alexander Hamilton, but he made the decisions, and he led the country, and the country needed somebody stable, somebody ready, somebody who had proven himself, and it was just George Washington. Just every biographer I've read, whether they are conservative or whether they are more liberal leaning, they all just talk about how Washington just had this presence and this leadership role, and everybody just looked up to him. No matter who they were, even enemies and friends, everybody respected him so much. Something that, most presidents, very few presidents in our history have had, that overwhelming support.
And for a stronger nation. And to that end, Hamilton began the great American tradition of having a 5-point plan. Point 1, establish the nation's credit worthiness. Hamilton realized that if the new nation wanted to be taken seriously, it had to pay off its debts, most of which had come during the war. And to do this, Hamilton proposed that the U.S. government assume the debts that the states had amassed. Point 2, create a national debt. That's something you don't hear politicians say these days. Hamilton wanted to create new interest-bearing bonds, hoping to give the rich people a stake in our nation's success. Point 3, create a...
And I believe that. I believe that you, especially as a voter, should have a stake in the success of this country. That is why I think if you are receiving government assistance, especially if you are solely dependent on government assistance, you probably should not vote. But anyone and everyone who pays taxes should vote. That's just my belief.
A Bank of the United States. This bank would be private and it would turn a profit for it.
So I am for the government buying up the debt and paying off the debt to other nations, but national bank is something I do not agree with.
Shareholders, but it would hold public funds and issue notes that would circulate as currency, and the bank would definitely be needed to house all the money that was expected to be raised from point 4, a whiskey tax. Then, as now,
Got
Americans like to
problems.
drink, and one sure way to raise money was to set an excise tax on whiskey, which might reduce drinking on the margins or cause people to switch to beer, but what it would definitely do is hurt small farmers who found the most profitable use of their grain was to distill it into sweet, sweet whiskey. So the whiskey tax really upset small farmers, as we will see in a moment. Point 5, encourage domestic industrial manufacturing by imposing a tariff. For those of you who think the U.S. was founded on free trade principles, think again. Now, you'll remember that the Republicans wanted an agrarian republic with freer trade, so they disliked pretty much all of Hamilton's plan. They also argued that none of this was in the Constitution, and they were right. This position of expecting government to be limited by the text of the Constitution came to be known as strict construction. But
So now I see where he's going. So he is saying that it was a mercantilist system because there was a tariff. I mean, under mercantilist Britain, you couldn't trade with Spain, period, at all. Under Alexander Hamilton, you can trade with other countries, but any imports that you bring in, there will be a tariff on them. Or maybe not that you an American brings in, but if the British bring in goods, there will be a tariff. If the Spanish bring in goods, there will be a tariff, a tax on those goods that are brought in. So it's still different from mercantilist system.
But the Republicans lacked a five-point plan of their own, so their only hope of success was to shave Hamilton's five-point plan down to 4 points, which is what they did. In 1790, Republicans, many of whom were Southerners like Jefferson, struck a bargain. They agreed to points 1 through 4 of Hamilton's plan in exchange for a permanent capital on the Potomac in the South, as opposed to the first 2 temporary capitals of the U.S. in New York and Philadelphia.
Here you go. Here's something hilarious. I read this from a book called Founding Brothers by Joseph J. Ellis. He's a famous historian for this time period, writes a lot of books about it. I'll probably bring some on when I do my book review. But he tells about this big debate about where the location of the capital should be. And the reason why they chose the Potomac is because they thought that the Potomac was more than likely the river that would cut through the whole continent to the Pacific. And then some other proposals were also built on some rivers that these congressmen thought were the route to the Pacific. And some of the rivers they suggested are basically creeks. So it's kind of comical, that debate the debate surrounding where to put the capital.
So the Hamiltonian economy won out for a while. Probably the most immediately controversial aspect of Hamilton's plan was the whiskey tax, and not just because people loved to drink, but also because farmers loved to turn their rye into whiskey into profits. In 1794, Western Pennsylvania farmers even took up arms to protest the tax, and that clearly could not stand. Washington actually led, at least for part of the way, a force of 13,000 men to put down this whiskey rebellion, becoming the only sitting president to lead troops in the field, and America continued to tax booze as it does to this day.
And my southern friends from the South will condemn this and say, will condemn this abuse of power, they say. However, the Constitution, Article 10, clearly states that rebellion is to be met, that states cannot rebel, and that Congress is authorized to put down any rebellions within the country. So it's clearly constitutional. Now, if their claim is that that Congress did not authorize Washington that power, that is something I can look into. That is something I'm not sure about, but I don't see why. If that information is there, put it in the comments, and then I'll disagree that Washington. I will say that Washington should have waited for congressional approval before he did that. So.
On the subject of foreign affairs, there was much more agreement. Just kidding. Hamilton wanted the U.S. to have close ties to Britain for commercial reasons, but Britain was perpetually at war with France, with whom the U.S. technically had a perpetual alliance. You know, because they helped us win the American Revolution, they gave us the Statue of Liberty and Marion Cotillard, etc. And the French Revolution made things even more complicated because Republicans liked it, but Federalists, being somewhat conservative and elitist, were afraid of it. This was especially true when French emissary Citizen Genet showed up in 1793 and started hiring American ships to attack British.
Okay, so here's what's funny. He just called the Federalists conservative. I mean, maybe in that regard, but then you'll hear, I'll hear from liberals saying, no, the Federalists, they were liberal because they were against slavery. This is why, for this area and this time period in history, you cannot attach what happened here to anything that's happening now. You just can't. It's impossible.
Ones. Britain, in response, began impressing American sailors, which sounds fun, but it isn't. It doesn't mean the British sailors wowed Americans with their awesome mermaid tattoos. It means they kidnapped them and forced them to serve in the British Navy. Washington dispatched Secretary of State John Jay to deal with the impressment issue, and he negotiated the boringly named Jay Treaty, which improved trade relations between the U.S. and Britain and said absolutely nothing about impressment or American shipping rights.
And this made the Republicans mad.
For the rest of his term, Washington just tried to ignore the problem, thereby inaugurating another presidential tradition, kicking big foreign policy problems down the line for future presidents. By the end of his presidency, George Washington was somewhat disillusioned by politics. His famous call for unity said that with slight shades of difference, you Americans have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. Washington warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally, saying that it agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. Still, by the time the diminutive John Adams took over as the second president,
and a lot of that is true, especially if you look at that that era in time. It was definitely true. I mean, a lot of maligning, a lot of backbiting, a lot of just nasty talk. Citizen Genet, yeah, it was pretty bad.
Americans had already divided themselves into two groups: elitist Federalists and Republicans who stood.
Elitist Federalists, come on. The Republicans were just as elitist. They had the party was ruled by the elites. Anyway.
Stood for freedom and equality and, oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple.
Let's see if I can guess it.
I guess the author of the mystery document. If I am right, I do not get shocked. If I am wrong, I do get shocked. All right, let's give it a go. Yes, ye lordy, ye haughty sex, our souls are by nature equal to yours. The same breath of God animates, enlivens, and invigorates us. Were we to grant that animal strength proved anything, taking into consideration the accustomed impartiality of nature, we should be induced to imagine that she had invested the female mind with superior strength as an equivalent for the bodily powers of man. But waiving this, however palpable advantage, for equality only we wish to contend.
Abigail Adams?
So the author of the mystery document is a badass woman. So we have here an argument, and a bit of a snarky one, for equality between men and women. All right, I can do this. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is too young, also probably not funny enough. Poor
Abigail Adams.
Stan, my official guess is Sarah Grimke. Dang it! Oh. Judith Sargent Murray. Oh, well, you know, as part of the patriarchy, I probably deserve this anyway. So
here's an interesting fact. New Jersey allowed women to vote all the way up until, I think, Jefferson's election. And I think women voted in Vermont as well.
Judith Sargent Murray reminds us that once unleashed, ideas like liberty and equality spread to places where neither the male Federalists nor the male Republicans wanted them to go. But back to Adams. His election in 1796 exposed a big flaw in our electoral system. Because the vice presidency went to whomever had the second highest total number of electoral votes, and that person happened to be Thomas Jefferson, we ended up in a situation where the president and the vice president were on opposite sides of the political spectrum, which was not good. So they changed the Constitution, but not until after the next election, which featured another screw-up. We are awesome at this! Side note, the Electoral College system would continue to misrepresent the will of the American voters, most notably in 1876, 1888, and 2000, but also in every election!
But that's to protect against mob rule. It's a safety net. It's to give small states representation in the presidential process.
Domestically, Adams continued Hamilton's policy, but Adams' presidency is best known for foreign problems, especially the way Adams' administration totally overreacted to problems with France. Because we were trying to maintain good commercial relationships with England, and England was perpetually at war with France, France ended up in a quasi-war with the United States despite our eternal alliance. They disrupted our shipping, we felt nervous about their increasingly violent revolution, and then, after 3 French emissaries tried to extort a bribe from the US government as part of negotiations, the so-called XYZ affair, because we didn't want to give the names of these bribe-seeking French scoundrels, the American public turned against France somewhat hysterically, as it will. Taking advantage of the hysteria, Adams pushed through the Alien and Sedition Act.
Yes.
The Alien Act lengthened the period of time it took to become a citizen, and the Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government. Among the more...
Yeah, that's a terrible, terrible... For our second president, that's a terrible act. To jail people because they speak out against your government. Just, oh man, we started off really bad on that one, you know. That's a direct violation of the First Amendment, and it should never happen, no matter who is president. And I don't care to, you know, today if any political party is working with our government institutions to silence dissenting voices. I'm not talking about riots, I'm not talking about just dissenting voices. Then we have to beware, because they're being just like John Adams and his Alien and Sedition Acts, which was wrong.
Famous people prosecuted under the Sedition Act was Matthew Lyon, a congressman from Vermont who was jailed for saying that John Adams was maybe not the best president ever. And while in jail, Lyon won re-election to Congress, which might indicate just how popular this law wasn't. It was so unpopular that Virginia and Kentucky's legislatures passed resolutions against it, claiming that it violated Americans' liberties and that state legislatures had the power to overturn or nullify any federal law that they found to violate the Constitution.
And I kind of agree with that. If it violates the Constitution, I think as a state, you have a right to not listen to it. I would, though, first say appeal it at the courts. And if the courts are corrupt, if the courts are ruled by the dissent, as long as it's unconstitutional, then yes, you probably have the right to say we're not going to obey that law.
This whole business of nullification and states' rights, it will return. The Alien and Sedition Acts were allowed to lapse under Jefferson, and they didn't lead to widespread arrests of everyone who called Adams a tyrant or expressed admiration for the French Revolution. And even though they weren't popular, they didn't doom the Federalist Party either, even though no Federalist was elected president after Adams. But the Alien and Sedition Acts and the response to them from Virginia and Kentucky are important because they show us how unsettled American politics were in the first decade of this country's existence. Even something as basic as freedom of speech was up for grabs as America tried to figure out what kind of country it was going to be. That's important to think about when studying American history, but it's also important to think about when looking at new democracies. You might think that Thomas Jefferson...
And I think if I remember right, Thomas Jefferson, when he came into power, passed a bill or a law that was similar to the Alien and Sedition Acts. It wasn't as strong as the Alien and Sedition Acts, but I think if it... I know he tried. Maybe it didn't pass, but I think he did try to pass a law, or he was in favor of a law because of all the criticism he was getting too. But it's never good. Never good to try to pass a law to silence your political opponents.
Jefferson winning the presidential election of 1800 settled all this stuff, but it wasn't so simple. It never is, really. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed.
All right, so that was pretty good. Again, disagreements here with some things, but overall, a very good video. Yeah, so there's nothing much I want to say except for, yes, I will be doing like book reviews. They'll be small, they won't be anything big. I don't expect to make a long video of them. So just stick around for that. Please like, share, subscribe, follow, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.